I'm not that tall. How's this? Hello, can you hear me? Yes, in the back? Yes? Good, great. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome. I'd like to start out my talk with a quick survey, show of hands. Has anyone here ever been criticized for the way you speak, or maybe been poked fun at for an accent, a way you pronounce a word? Wow, take a sec, look around. Great, that's a lot of hands, that's almost everybody's hands. We as a society can be very intolerant of diversity in language, right? Many of us talk differently and people give us grief for it. There's a reason for this. It comes from a common misconception that there is one true, correct way to speak the English language, right? Just like there is only one true, correct way to do math, okay? 2 + 2 is never going to equal 5, no matter what Big Brother tries to tell you. Or just like the way there's only one true, correct way to measure things, right? So this is the original meter stick. You can go see it in Paris. It set the standard for the metric system, right? And now any meter stick or any yardstick or any ruler you buy, it has to be one particular length, right? Because there's no room for variation in measuring, just like there's no room for variation in doing math. But English and language more generally is not like this, okay? The idea that there is one single correct English is a myth. With language, correctness is arbitrary and it is subjective. And if you start digging through the historical record, you quickly realize that what we think of today as correct English has not always been such, okay? So let's do a quick little survey. Is there anything wrong with this sentence? This is a headline from the Wall Street Journal. I pulled it from a couple of weeks ago. It says, conservative groups jeopardize GOP plan to repeal Affordable Care Act. Is there any bad English in this headline? I mean, it was good enough for the Wall Street Journal writers and editors, right? It seems fine to me. It might surprise you that these words have not always been unobjectionable. Specifically, this word jeopardize was singled out by Richard Grant White, who was a grammarian writing in 1870 as a foolish and intolerable word, okay? He wasn't alone in this. He was joined in this by many 19th century critics. At the time, you were supposed to use jeopard, okay? It meant the exact same thing that jeopardize means now, to put someone in danger. But that was what you were supposed to use in 1870. My spell checker underlines that word jeopard now, right? English doesn't use it anymore because what's perceived to be good English has changed, right? Here's another one. There are lots of these. You may not realize that simply using the word you, Y-O-U, was once objectionable. So in the English of the 1600s, you was only acceptable when talking to more than one person, okay? It was the 17th century equivalent of y'all or you guys. When you're speaking to one person, it was thou that was supposed to be used instead, right? And we still see thou when we read archaic books, or the Bible uses thou, but only to talk to one person. Thou fell out of use, right? We don't use it anymore, but people didn't let it go without a fight. So here's Thomas Elwood, a writer, writing in 1714. He calls the use of you to address one single person an evil custom, which has since corrupted the modern languages and have greatly debased the spirits and depraved the manners of men. Great, hell in a handbasket, because we're using you to refer to one person. These kind of dramatic opinions don't only apply to the words we choose to use, they also apply to how we pronounce them. So, is there a problem with how we pronounce these words today? Disturbed, rebuked, fledged. They sound pretty normal, right? Well, in the 1700s, there was, okay, these words had traditionally, for centuries beforehand, been pronounced with an extra syllable. So for hundreds of years, people said disturbed, rebuked, fledged, and so forth. But then people started shortening them. And many language purists were very unhappy about this. So none other than Jonathan Swift, the author of Gulliver's Travels, referred to this as that barbarous custom of abbreviating words. He said, instances of this abuse are innumerable, where, by leaving out a vowel to save a syllable, we form so jarring a sound, and so difficult to utter, that I have often wondered how it could ever obtain. This, I think, is a clear indicator that opinions about language are really in the eye of the beholder, right? Because there's really nothing difficult or jarring about the way these words are pronounced to us. Disturbed, rebuked, they're very easy to say. As hard as it can be for some of us to accept, language isn't a static entity. It's like fashion. It's always changing. One era's normal is another era's barbarous custom, right? Having told you this, it might not surprise you now to learn that it goes both ways, okay? So there are some aspects of language that many of us see as barbarous customs nowadays that once upon a time were perfectly acceptable. So I want to take as an example the pronunciation of the word ask, which many speakers pronounce as ax. You see memes like this, did you want to ask me or ax me, because seriously, one is murder. As if you can't tell what somebody intends when they say, let me ask you a question. Pretty clear you're not going to get murdered, but you may have heard people criticize this as incorrect usage, saying ax for ask, and indeed that's what this cartoon is getting at, but it wasn't always like that. Okay, so Geoffrey Chaucer, the greatest English poet of the Middle Ages, used ax for ask. So here's Chaucer writing in the 1300s saying, you lovers, ax I now this question, as did the first complete English translation of the Bible. It has here ax and it shall be given you. Ax was the standard accepted way of pronouncing this verb in English for a long time. It is ask that from the historical point of view is the wrong form, right? One last example of these, the use of what's called double negatives, where we use two negatives in a sentence for a negative meaning, as in we don't need no education or I can't get no satisfaction. You may have heard people rant about double negatives, saying that these sorts of sentences are wrong because they are illogical. How can two negatives make a negative if two negatives make a positive in math? First of all, I will point out that two negatives only make a positive in math when you multiply them. When you add them, you get something that's more negative, right? The idea that language like math is a non-starter. But beyond that, moreover, this used to be how English was spoken. Okay, so here's a sentence from a letter written by a 15th century merchant, Richard Seeley. He says, I have great marvel that you write not to me no letters. He's using a double negative. And if you think he used this double negative because he was uneducated, I will remind you that only educated people knew how to write in the 1400s, okay? This is a clear indication that this used to be the proper way of making a negative sentence in English. I'll also point out that if you've studied French, you know that double negatives are completely acceptable there. So here's a sentence of standard French, je ne regrette rien. If you translate this directly into English, it has a double negative. I don't regret nothing. If you try to leave one of these negatives out of your French homework, it's going to get corrected. Right? Every community and every language has a way of speaking that is perceived as the norm, like this, the accepted, the correct, the standard language. But when we dig into it, it turns out there's nothing inherently better about this way of speaking. We know this because we can find other communities or other eras where the exact same way of speaking is or was seen as unacceptable and incorrect. So, why do people respect the standard language so much? Why does it strike us as barbarous when somebody uses some other way of speaking? Well, I'll let you in on a little secret. The language held up by society as correct is simply the language of the people in power. There's nothing inherently better about it. It's just the way the people in charge happen to speak. As the seat of power shifts, or as those in power change the way they talk, the norm changes. Different societies settle on different language norms because different people are in charge. The analogy that I kind of like to use is the side of the road that you drive on, right? So Brits have settled on driving on the left. Americans have settled on driving on the right. There's nothing inherently better about either of these options. We just have different norms. Just like modern day standard English has different norms about how to make a negative sentence than modern day standard French does, or 14th century English did. It's an arbitrary choice passed down from the people in charge. Unfortunately, in the case of language, it's an arbitrary choice with major social consequences, right? Members of marginalized groups are frequently discriminated against, and we'll hear more about that later, for not speaking the standard language. But by definition, the standard language is whatever language marginalized groups aren't speaking, right? So this perpetuates social inequality. So I'm going to end just by asking, what can we do to address this? I mean, I may not like the US custom of driving on the right, but I can't, as one person, suddenly rebel and try to change it and start driving on the left, right? We would have chaos. Similarly, language norms are very deeply entrenched in society and they can be very slow to change. So short of a language revolution, which I would respect, but that seems unlikely, I would say we can recognize that society has certain expectations about which language we should use, but simultaneously keep in mind that there's nothing inherently better about the language society has deemed correct, and fight back when we hear people argue otherwise. Thank you.